Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues and guests. Allow me to open the session of the dissertation board of the applicant Mariia Panina, the applicant for the degree of candidate of Philology, and the specialization 10.01.03, the foreign literature, the literature of foreign Middle East, on the topic the image of Russia and Russians in Chinese journalism using the travel essays. Under the order issued by St. Petersburg State University on December 29, 2018, number 13058/1, I, Alexander Starozhuk, Doctor of Philology, Head of the Department of Chinese Philology at the Faculty of Oriental Studies of St. Petersburg State University, was appointed the chairperson of this dissertation board. And allow me to introduce my colleagues, the members of the board. Nikolai Samoilov, Doctor of History, the Head of the Department of Social Development of the Countries of Asia and Africa of the Faculty of Oriental Studies of St. Petersburg State University. Mikhail Pelevin, Doctor of Philology, Head of the Department of Iranian Philology of the Faculty of Oriental Studies of St. Petersburg State University. Irina Kolganyak, Doctor of Philology, Chief Researcher with imposed duty of the Head of the Sector of Central Asia of the Department of Central and Southern Asia of the Institute of Oriental Manuscripts of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And in remote mode we have Professor Van Lier, Doctor of Philology, Beijing University of Foreign Languages from China. First of all, I would like to particularly stress that according to the federal law as of August 23, 1996, number 127 FZ on the science and state and scientific and technical policy, St. Petersburg State University is entitled to confer its own academic degrees, and the corresponding order on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University, based on which we hold our session, was issued September 1st, 2016. And it has the number 6821/1, and afterwards it will be called just order. According to the above-mentioned order, the session of the dissertation board is valid, providing 2/3 of the appointed board members are present, but no less than 4 people. Our dissertation board consists of 5 people. All of them are present, including the professor in remote mode, and we have audiovisual contact established with him, and therefore we have the quorum. And the agenda of our today's session is as follows. The session should last no more than 2 hours. First will be the short report of the chairman on the main about the documents submitted by the candidate for the degree and their conformity with the requirements. After that, we may have answers to questions if there are any, for no more than 5 minutes. Then, candidate's short presentation providing an overview and findings of the research, 15 minutes, no more. Third, questions to the candidate regarding the presentation, no more than 2 minutes per question, and the replies of the candidate. Fourth, the reports of all the board members in turns, with reports stating their positions and offers to the applicant, no more than 10 minutes per speaker. 5, the chairman's report on the thesis. 6, the candidate's comments about the report and replies to the questions to the board members, no more than 15 minutes. Third, open discussion. The speeches of anyone present at the session with a short statement of their positions or with specific questions or offers to the applicant just on the topic of the research, no more than 5 minutes per each person willing to speak out. And at the same time, I would like to ask all the willing to speak out to register in the registration form and give their full name before the speech. Then candidates' replies to the questions that will follow, no more than 5 minutes. 9 is the presentation of the candidate's thesis. Supervisor, unfortunately, the supervisor did not manage to be present here today, therefore I will read the report. Then we will have the discussion, 5-minute discussion, because before the open voting on conferring or non conferring the academic degree to the applicant. And during the discussion of the results of the defense, the broadcast is turned off. 11. Open balloting, vote counting, and recording the results in the protocol. 9 is making a decision on whether to confer or not to confer the academic title of St. Petersburg State University, and then the candidate's closing speech, no more than 2 minutes. And before we switch to our agenda, I would like to remind you about the need to turn off your mobile phones or to silence them. Thank you very much for understanding. I would like to also inform you that we have the broadcast and live broadcast at the St. Petersburg State University website, and we have simultaneous interpreting provided from Russian into English, or if a need arises, from English into Russian. So let us start. And first of all, our first point of the agenda is the short report of the chairman. The thesis of Mariia Panina for the PhD in Philology in specialization 10.01.03 Foreign Literature, the Far East and Middle East Literature, on the topic the image of Russia and Russians in the contemporary Chinese journalism, travel essays, was taken for defense by the order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg State University, issued on December 29, 2018, number 12845/1. The dissertation board was established by the order of the Academic Secretary on December 27, 2018, number 13058/1. And dear colleagues and guests, I've already introduced the members of the board. As for the applicant has submitted the following documents to the Academic Secretary. First, the application in the name of the rector, Professor Nikolai Kropachev, with a request to examine the thesis and to accept it for the defense. It was submitted November 14, 2017. Second, the report of scientific advisor Nadezhda Khudziatova, candidate of Philology, Professor of Sinology Department, the School of Regional and International Studies of Far East and Federal University. Third, the list of published works containing 7 items which describe the research findings of the thesis, including 2 articles in peer-reviewed journals recommended by the Ministry of Education and Science, and 1 article in an issue index in Web of Science and Scopus databases. Fourth, the letter of verification certifying that the applicant has passed the PhD exams issued by the Far East Federal University, and it demonstrates that Mariia has passed the exams in the field 10.01.03 Foreign Literature, namely History of Philosophy, Chinese Language A mark, Literature of Foreign Countries, Chinese Literature A mark. Then the copy of Higher Education Diploma, University Diploma 10/524, number 3306/328, issued by the Far Eastern Federal University, certifying that Mariia Panina has mastered the program of preparation of scientific and teaching staff in PhD course in the field 45.06.01, Language Studies and Literature Studies, and was conferred a degree teacher researcher. Then also the thesis in the Russian and in English on paper carrier with manuscript copyright and in the digital form. The dissertation is formed in accordance with all the necessary norms and requirements. I beg your pardon, technical problem. So I beg your pardon, a technical break for 1 minute. So we can proceed. Now everything is okay. No, we just restored the communication in the line and we can continue. So can we proceed? Yes. Okay. It should be noted that all the above-mentioned documents conform with point 12 from section 3 of the order on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. Application Appendix 1 to the order. And now I would like to give the floor to the applicant to the academic degree, and I would like to remind that it should take no more than 15 minutes. So please. Good afternoon, distinguished chairman, distinguished members of the board, dear friends and colleagues. The image of one country represented in the language and literature and culture of another country is a topic that is relevant in all times for researchers. In contemporary conditions, regardless of the strengthening of ties between China and Russia, and lack of knowledge and culture and bias that are ingrained in society can hinder the establishing of contacts. And studying how Chinese people see us and corresponding this, comparing this data with how they see their nation, we should search for ways to bring the nations and cultures closer and thus promote the fruitful dialogue of both countries and reduce the negative impact of misunderstanding. The image of Russia in China is considered by domestic scientists within the framework of different approaches and on different materials. That's a politology, imagological approach, and culturological approach. And today, there's no literature studies that are dedicated to the study of the image of Russia on materials of contemporary Chinese literature. And mostly these are works written during the Soviet period by Vasily Alexeyev, Mark Schneider, and Leonid Cherkassky, dedicated to the issues of reception of Russian and Soviet literature in China. Methodological basis of this research is compiled of the works of contemporary scientists beyond the sinology circles. Elena Papilova, Valery Zemskov, Oleg Polyakov, and also the works of Chinese colleagues Liu Lingyi, Liu Xinyan, He Hui, and other foreign scientists. The objective of this research based on travel essays, I would like to outline the characteristics and the modes of establishing and the functioning of the image of Russia and Russians in Chinese journalists within the framework of interdisciplinary approach that is adequate to the nature of such journalism in China. The image of the nation is studied on idea, aesthetic, and language field, including the idea, genre, and composition analysis, the analysis of creative means, temporal and spatial relations of the text, and the ways to give the author's position. An important component of literature analysis in the work is detecting the combination of three types of modi. Fictional, publicistic, and journalistic. A methodological approach to the study of the image of the nation allows us to consider the characteristics of self within the framework of the opposition of self and the other. Content analysis provides for a base of research of qualitative and quantitative distribution of characteristics that provides for the comparison of the range of interpretation. The material is provided by 4 Chinese writers and publicists dedicated to Russia and Russia. Mafulin, in his essay as Russia Black and White, 10 years of experience of a Chinese in Russia, shares his experience of long-term being in Russia. The essays of Ye Yongle, Witnessing Russia, and Go Chen, Nordost Siege, My Experience, are concentrated mostly on political and historical topics. And the travel notes of Fan Zicai, notes on 2 cities in Russia, that's a kind of guide across the Russian culture. The first 3 authors are not quite familiar to the Russian readers, and Fan Zicai have several times been translated into Russian language, including the active participation of sinologists of St. Petersburg State University. The work is made up of 3 sections. The first section gives a system of methods applicable to the study of the image of the nation in fiction and publicistic works. Second section studies contemporary approach to studying journalism and demonstrates the Socratic character of contemporary Chinese journalism. And third section analyzes the travel essays on Russia. I beg your pardon, a technical break to establish communication because we had a break in communication with the speaker.
Professor просто вышел.
Professor just went out. Okay, then we'll continue. And third section analyzes the texts of travel essays on Russia. The works are considered in the time of their publication, according to the time of their publication. The image of Russia and Russians is researched in chronological order from the year 2000 to 2010, and this stage is characterized by the rise in interest of both countries to each other because the Chinese society, that is in the form of active reforms, demonstrates interest to the experience of reforms of Russia as heir of the big brother USSR, and this assessment is done for explicit and implicit assessment of the way that Chinese undertook. And the study of the image of Russia is introduced by the consideration of the peculiarities of Chinese fictional literature at contemporary state and its place in the literature classification. And these essays are included into the range of essay literature of Bao Gao Wengxue that in turn is included in non-fictional prose Sanwen. And this publicism, Bao Gao Wengxue, is a more syncretic product than publicism in domestic and Western understanding, and it allows for the opportunity to divide the information and aesthetic processing of the fact and the expression of the author's opinion. And in order to analyze the image of Russia in the works of Chinese writers, we have such components of the image as concept, stereotype, and imagem. Coupled concepts, as a rule, represent binary oppositions, and stereotypical notions, imagems, like, for example, proper names that symbolize the country, are grouped in categories of material and spiritual, culture, national character, economics, politics. Depending on the explicit or implicit assessment of the authors, of the category self and other are marked by minuses or pluses, for example, minus for the other and plus for the self, but this scheme is not as simple, and markers plus and minus can be introduced in a cross manner both for the self and for the other. Mafalin essays Black and White Russia, 10 years of experience of Chinese living in Russia, gives rich material on the persons of the Russian and Soviet politicians, on the service sector, on nature and ecology, on the routine and character of Russians. And this duality, that is the prevailing concept of the Chinese essay writer for Russia, is expressed by concepts Black and White Russia. For example, Russians can't rationally use their richness, and, for example, the achievements of spiritual culture also goes together with a rational character and lagging behind of material culture. And it was detected that there is a negative attitude prevalence to the other, but still the richness of the fictional tools allows the author to overcome the visible stereotypes on Russia. For example, the fixed negative stereotype on laziness and thriftlessness of Russians in developing the land is neutralized by the description of the care about animals, and the author says that that is the experience that his compatriots should follow. And also, it allows the author an opportunity to think about the peculiarities of the self and to criticize it in an implicit form. But generally, the subjective fictional modes prevails, and the irony on the self and the other leads to bringing closer the national characters of the Chinese and the Russians. And as for the essay of Ye Yunle, Russia, Witnessing Russia, the image of Russia is disclosed in the framework of political topics, and being a kind of expert, author negatively assesses the internal policy of Russia and makes it with a contrast with economic and social policy of Russia. And unlike Mafalin, here we see the prevalence of not judgments based on personal experience, but rather formed ideological opinion, mostly suppressing the creative component of the essay. The results of content analysis demonstrated that in the range of historical and political persons represented by Ye Yunle, unexpectedly on the first place in the references number we have Nicholas II, the emperor, and his destiny is a key to understanding the historical and political root of Russia. The swift change of power at the turn of the 20th century, and the denunciation of the historical experience is a kind of anti-example, and there is a positive assessment of the attempts to get back to the traditions, for example, reburial of the remains of the emperor's family and returning the orthodox positions. And as key concepts of the image of the country, we have outlined the collapsing Soviet Union that denounced the centuries-old traditions, and reviving Russia that restores its traditions. Essay No Dosage, My Experience by Go Chen is dedicated to a terrorist attack on Dubrovka in 2002, but due to the creative character of the essay, that's not objective information from the point of view of the actions, but rather a retrospective and emotional reflection caused by the events. And despite the negative connotation, the political image of Russia is positive, and the author demonstrates support and understanding of the actions of the Russian government. And this image of the nation of fighters is established due to the representation of notions of strict yet fair politics of the Russian leader, and also the portrait of Russian Guanin, the girl that sacrificed her life to the benefit of the hostages. And the results of content analysis allows us to state that the image of Russia is represented by concepts weak Russia and strong Russia. Fancy Thai book, the notes on 2 cities in Russia, is dedicated to trips across Moscow, St. Petersburg, and a range of other cities, and according to the author himself, it represents a combination of essay, notes, and also some reports. And for Fancy Tsai, Russia is culture-centered and literature-centered nation, and this is supported by the calculation and content analysis of image gems. And in order to state that understanding is mostly based on the close components of spiritual culture between the Russia and China. Fanzitsai juxtaposes the scale of the personality of Leo Tolstoy and Sin, compares Mikhail Lermontov and Van Bo and artist Van Semen, and also compares Anna Akhmatova with Chinese poets Zhu Yiman and Li Qinzhao. And it is the culture, according to Fanzitsai, that outlines the best traits in the national character of Russians. Political and economic economy images of Russia are represented positively but in a fragmented manner. And being simultaneously an expert and an artist, the Chinese writer influences the reader both rationally and emotionally, imposing the thought on the need to appreciate your country and your culture and the culture of the other more. So based on the summarizing of these approaches given in the scientific literature, the work outlined the system of methods applicable to studying the image of the nation in fictional works, and we outlined contemporary approaches to the studies of journalism, and I've also demonstrated the syncretic character of Chinese publicism. And within the framework of interdisciplinary approach, we've outlined individual authors and collective stereotypical components of the image of Russia. And we consider the functioning of the image of Russia and the Russians in authors' essays, considering the fictional character of Chinese journalism. And also systemic interdisciplinary approach allowed to outline the borders of fictional publicistic and journalist modi in the essays, and also to prove the existence of different components of the image of Russia, concepts with positive and negative connotation. Also to demonstrate the notions of the ideas of Chinese authors on Russian culture that is the basis for bringing closer Russia and China and establishing contacts between the two countries. The conclusions made on the basis of the image of Russia and China can provide recommendations to improve the national image of Russia in the international arena. And as far as we see it, we should have an increase in the number of publications supporting the stereotypical notions of the Chinese on the beauty and strength of Russian culture in the form of translations of classical and contemporary Russian literature to the Chinese language. And as for the promising topics for further use, I see the use of a method of content analysis using computer programs, and also the increase in the text databases, including the works on Russia in the stated period and in the following period. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Are there any questions to the applicant on the report? Yes?
I have the following question. Why have you decided to choose these particular authors? Because we have a wider source of sources, but you have selected these four, only the works of these four authors. That's the first question. And the second question, you translate the title as the Nordost, the siege of Nordost eyewitness account, but you have demonstrated the title right now, and we do not see the word Nordost in the title. Thank you very much. Why have I chosen those titles, those sources? I have been selecting from the Chinese database of scientific and periodical literature based on keywords Russia and essay literature. Which is the Baogao literature, and they are relevant in terms of the period of the research and in terms of the modus terms of Chinese essay literature. In terms of translation, title translation, basically the original title is translated as an incident with hostages in Moscow, but as a translator I decided that for the Russian reader it would be clearer if I coin the term, the notion which is used here but not translated literally. Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions, please? Mr. Rodionov, first Deputy Head of the Department of the Oriental Studies. My question is the continuation of the first one, taking into account your answer. We don't understand the number of Chinese people, including Chinese writers in Russia is an enormous one, so the flow is quite enormous as well. But you have selected 4 ones in the database based on keywords Russia and Bulgaria went here. Okay, but basically you have selected Fan Zitsai notes of the 2 cities in Russia, but you haven't selected his second work, Listening to Russia, because he was coming to Russia several times and he published a book every time. And one of them was published in 2004, 2005, and the other one was published in 2015. So why haven't you picked up the recent one, and also why haven't you selected one-man work as well? Thank you very much for your question. Here it would be quite complicated to embrace all the works, including objective reasons as well, in terms of the use of the search engine. Fan Zitsai, if we talk about later works, is relevant as well because it enables us to compare the image of Russia after 2010 with earlier images introduced in the first 3 works. And of course, thank you very much for your hints and clarifications. In my further work, I will scrutinize other works which I haven't covered within the framework of this work. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions left? Thank you, colleagues. Now we're shifting to the next point, voicing the reports, including the external ones, but basically we haven't received any external reports. That is why we are shifting to the reports by the members of the Dissertation Board. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Samoilov. The report to the dissertation by Mariia Panina dedicated to the topic the image of Russia and Russians in modern Chinese journalism based on Chinese travel essays, specialization 10-0103, PhD thesis, literature. The dissertation is quite relevant within the context of the drastic development of modern Russian-Chinese relations and the achievement of mutual understanding of our countries in different fields. Moreover, cultural field, which includes literature ties, is one of the main segments of bilateral cooperation. Currently, comprehensive research of interaction of states and nations, besides the research of economic, political and cultural factors, is to involve careful scrutiny of images of different nations and countries in public thought and mind of other nations. The permanent image of the other is influencing the relations between individuals, which is evident, but also influences the formation of politics of different states. And this factor currently is taken into account in international activities of many states and in their foreign policy, which is to the large extent a defining one when we develop the so-called soft power policy. And currently we are discussing the issue of the impression the state makes and its representative make on the international arena. What's the image of the country in world community? Besides, recent research have proved the existence of images and stereotypes of perception of one nations by others in the run of the history and influence of other historic forms on their future development. Basing on that, the research of state and ethnic images and stereotypes is extremely relevant both for scientific and practical sense of the word. And that is very important, not only to follow the evolution of images of different peoples, following their dynamics of their development in space and time, but also to define the reasons of the emergence and reinforcement of images of other nations within the framework of your own national spiritual tradition. Within the framework of such context, such research is relevant and important, which embraces methods and data of different sciences, sociology, ethnology, social psychology, literature science, and others. Without such an interdisciplinary approach, it's impossible to understand the images of different nations and to follow the dynamics of its development. The importance and relevance of the research of such problematics based on the analysis of Russia's image evolution in Russia is connected with the fact that a lot of research is turned to this topic, and the proof of that is a huge scientific project, the image of Russia and West in China in the 20th century, evolution, continuity, and accidental factor base conducted by the team of scientists at St. Petersburg State University and Heidelberg University in Germany.
Через WeChat выйдем, да. Коллеги, вопрос такой.
So, colleagues, the question is the following. We have the quorum even without Professor Van Lee, and we also have his report in case we don't manage to get in touch with him before the end of our session. My suggestion is the following. We should continue right now and to keep getting in touch with the professor, and I hope that we'll succeed. So I beg your pardon, Mr. Samoilov. So we can state that the processes of the stereotype formation are the integral part of the interaction process of societies and cultures, and the research of their nation is becoming more and more widely, are becoming wider, and they are researched with the use of different sciences and methods. And today we have a clear-cut interdisciplinary scientific direction, imagology, which is described in many details in the thesis by Mariia Panina, so it proves the relevance of their work. The author of the dissertation, within the framework of the research of the image formation of a different nation, turns to an extremely important complex of sources to modern Chinese journalism, which is reflecting the peculiar traits of the development of images of Russia and Russians in China. I should emphasize that The work is very clear, as well as its goal, the definition of constant characteristics and the means to create the image of Russia and Russians in modern Chinese journalism within the framework of comprehensive interdisciplinary approach in terms of the research of the nation image and adequate fictional character of journalism in China, including the goals which are embracing theoretic approaches and methods of research. The thesis is based on a vast number of Chinese sources and scientific literature, and also there is a combination of different methods and tools for literature analysis and imagology paradigm. The relevance of the thesis is connected with the fact that main works used to scrutinize the image of Russia and Russians from the standpoint of history, politology, and culturology, works by Tikhinsky, Samoilov, Lysian, and others. The research of Russia's image in Chinese literature, including journalism and essays of late 20th century, 21st century, haven't been conducted, and there are no specialized works dedicated to the role of Chinese journalism in the process of formation of Russia's image, and these gaps are filled with this PhD thesis. The thesis has great practical value because the analysis of modern image of Russia and Russians in China, which is formed thanks to journalism and results based on that, can be practically applied in research and also in relevant entities and structures, taking into account the politics, establishment, and the creation of international image of the state. And it also leads to the mitigation of negative influence and misunderstanding, which is the part of cultural priorities. The thesis is not only a practical one, but also has a theoretical value within the development of comprehensive interdisciplinary approach to the formation of Russia's image and Russians' image in modern Chinese journalism based on humanitarian imagology and literature and precise content analysis, methods of analysis of journalism forms of modern Chinese literature. And conclusions of the thesis can be very useful for further research of modern Chinese journalism and its peculiar traits. The structure of the thesis has 3 chapters, and they comply with the goals and the content of the thesis. The first chapter scrutinizes methodology of nation research, nation image research, and there is a characteristic of interdisciplinary approach in the sphere of imagology research. The second is dedicated to modern approach of Chinese journalism studies and its peculiar traits, and the third one is analyzing the works by 4 above-mentioned Chinese writers and journalists of the early 21st century dedicated to Russia, and they are analyzed in the sequence defined by the author, and it is characterized by the drastic increase of interest of both countries and peoples to each other. All the 3 chapters are almost equal in size, though the third chapter could have been larger if author had filled it with more material and information which would make the conclusions even more convincing. There are some remarks in terms of main statements for the thesis. There are many more. Many of them 10 statements, and some of them are divided into sub-statements, and not all of them are proved and justified by the thesis itself, and some of them, such as the research of national image within the framework of interdisciplinary approach, which include content analysis and literature criticism analysis, having no proof or justification. Some seem quite strange Imagology concepts are connected with economy and politics of Russia, but the material culture of the other one is perceived as the negative revelation of national character, laziness, thriftlessness, and alcohol abuse. It's difficult to agree with the fact that laziness, which is the characteristic trait of an individual, can be one of the elements of the material culture, as well as alcohol abuse. And authors are taken about alcohol abuse, which is a non-controlled use of alcohol, which influences work in a negative way, but not about alcohol abuse, which is a chronic psychological disease. The author states that the spiritual culture of Russia is estimated by Chinese authors in a positive way. It could be like that, but we should mention that everything is quite dubious and the perception is quite ambivalent. Also, there are some remarks in terms of imagology part of the thesis. First, there is a clear mistake when we talk about the term imagology, which is derived from the English word image. Actually, the imagology term and the English word image is derived from Latin word imago, image, and the English word image and term gave the source to another discipline, image studies, something which is scrutinizing images. The problem is a different one. The Russian language is richer because this term is derived in different ways in the Russian language, but in the English language it sounds in the similar way. And Chinese language uses the term sin censure, and I think that the author could have dwelt upon that in more details, describing the history of the research and methodology. Author is referring to the predecessors, but we can state that the majority of researchers have been mentioned by Ms. Panina, but unfortunately we see the lack of the name of the French researcher Sylvain Marandon, who have contributed greatly to the establishment of this scientific research. Her interesting works emerged in the 1960s, and I think that should have been the starting point in terms of literature imagology. Mariia Panina states that the definition of image notion is very complicated in terms of many meanings it has in the Russian language. It leads to the fact that each researcher has to define the notions which he perceives within the framework of this term, and after that she coins the notions of such terms: image, stereotype, perceptions. But the author unfortunately forgets about the fact that for the first time this question was raised in 1995 within the framework of Russian Oriental Studies, when one of the sinologists, and that's me, proposed and offered his own notions connected with perception, stereotype, biases, image, which could be applicable to imagology problematics. So that's the book edited by Ms. Verbitskaya and other esteemed scientists, and that's where this issue was raised for the first time. Deeper penetration of the author of the thesis in history of the issue and scrutiny of history of Chinese imagology direction would have reinforced the theoretical part of the thesis, and another benefit could have been connected with another aspect of research if Ms. Panina had tried to define which stereotypes were influencing the authors of travel essays before they came to Russia, and what was justified and proved, but what had to be rejected within the framework of direct contact with Russian realities. Undoubtedly, that's not the travel essay by Go Santao, and he was the first Chinese envoy who came to England in 1876-77, when he thought that he was coming to a wild country, because he was thinking that England was something similar to Hans. But when he came to England, his notion changed, and those travel essays, if you had mentioned them, if you had mentioned those travel essays of the 19th century and Go Santao with his ideas, it would have been more profound, and I think it would have been more expedient. And of course, if modern journalists wouldn't have such drastic differences in perception as Go Santao had had, who was talking about serving foreign devils, everything could have been comparable as well still. But nevertheless, the author managed to cope with all the goals and to provide comprehensive research of essays of Chinese authors dedicated to Russia within the framework of interdisciplinary research based on literature analysis. Main conclusions do not raise any contradictions, and we can agree with the fact that main concepts defined by Chinese journalists within the framework of imagology approach concept imageum are compared with main Chinese realities, and it is correct, and we can make the conclusion that the thesis by Ms. Panina is a profound scientific work which is dedicated to the image formation of Russia and Russians in modern China, and is fulfilled on a relevant scientific level. And the thesis by Mariia Panina, The Image of Russia and the Russians in Contemporary Chinese Journalism, Travel Essays, compiles with the requirements of St. Petersburg State University, and Ms. Panina is to be granted with PhD in accordance with her specialization 10-0103, Foreign Literature, Literature of Middle and Far East. Thank you very much, Mr. Samoilov. And our next
that's my review for the work of Mariia Evgenievna, and it was I would like to say that it was submitted on time to the dissertation board, and it is already given on the website. Therefore, I won't read out my entire review, but I would like to dwell upon the key provisions of such discussion character, and also the ideas that I would like to give to the author. First, the general impression is quite favorable on the work, and I fully agree with the fact that the topic of the thesis is quite relevant, and indeed it is dedicated to a relevant topic, and the issue of cultural dominance is a basic issue when we study the contacts of people and their communication. And in the context of the main goals, the author understood correctly that the basis of the image of the nation is formed by such constants that are ingrained in the conscience as the opposition, the self and the other. Then I would like to note that the work of Mariia Evgenievna Panina for sure is literature studies work, and that is very important as well, I believe, because both the objective that was established and the issues that are considered in the work are dealing with literature problems, and these are the basic issues, and there are quite a lot of them, but still the key ones are as follows. The ways of establishing the image of Russia and the Russians in contemporary Chinese journalism as a place and role, and the content of the category of Chinese journalism, and also the description of the syncretic character of Chinese journalism and detection of the individual authors and collective stereotype components of the image. And also I believe that all the scientific proposals are justified, and also I have a very positive view of the fact that the author is aware of the works of Lotman, Alexeyev and others, and with the later works of literature experts Ashepkov, Panov, Bazilevsky, 163 titles of works that you give in your report in bibliography. Well, that's quite impressive, and that's in Chinese, in English and Russian. Therefore, I believe that it substantiates the fullness of the knowledge in this topic. As for the novelty of the work, well, I believe I would like to dwell upon that as well. I would like to emphasize the novelty of this work because it is, first of all, established by the setting of the ideas brought to the defense, and the key scientific ideas of the applicant, the new ones, are well, there are more than 10 of them, and I would like to dwell upon two that attracted my attention: the research of the national image in fictional publicism, maybe within that is possible within the framework of interdisciplinary approach that studies imagological and literature studies methods and content analysis, and also such a notion as the variety of contemporary fiction and publicist forms is a result of the combination of traditional genres with journal publicism within that was done due to a modernization of Chinese literature in the 20th century. The importance, well, of the results of the author of the dissertation, I believe, is necessary to stress, because that's the new knowledge to literature scientists on the heritage of Chinese literature. And of particular importance is the fact that the author summarizes the history of Chinese literature studies and outlines the range of issues that did not get a lot of research, and talks about the methods of studies, defines concepts, dominance, and stylistic tools. And as for general conclusion, it is correct, it is exact logic, and I have no doubts about it. And agreeing with the basic provisions of the work provided in the thesis, I believe that the conclusions of the author are substantiated, and the novelty is the thing that we have no doubts about it. We have good Russian language here, but as a remark, critical remark that you should take into account in further developing this topic, maybe I would like to stress the following thing. For example, we understand the method of study chosen by the author. That's phenomenological approach based on the combination of the basic scientific notions that are based on a phenomenological paradigm. Yet, as far as we see it, when we talk about the methodology of the study, we can't say, well, how author writes. Methodology is based on poetics, that considers the works as an aesthetic object. Well, this definition brings aesthetics and poetics closer, too close, and it becomes wider and less specific. Poetics is a section in the theory of literature that's about the expression, about the theory of poetics. That's the science studying poetic activities, forms, notions, and the laws of literature in general. Well, that definition does not change the correct understanding of the author of the principles of functioning of the nation's image that the author writes quite correctly. And I won't give you the quotes here. Then, Giving correct definition of imagology as quite a recent interdisciplinary section of knowledge that studies the image of the nations and the peoples in politology, in international relations, in PR, in literature studies, sociology, ethnopsychology, culturology, and so on. Each of them, by the way, has different methods of study. Still, author, I believe, does not give the correct time. You give the end of the 20th century on 6th page. That is correct for Russian science, I believe, but we know that this term of sociological research emerged in the 20th century, and the works of Guillard, that's mid-20th century as well. That's how I see it. And yet another remark is on the use of the self and the other, the self and another one. The author chose the term the other. Yet it seems to me that the self and the other are not fully autonomous to each other, and there is a certain field of their combination. The other can be the self. And maybe I would use a different term, alien one. The one, the self and the alien one. And I believe that this alien one is more exact, the translation from English. Maybe we should talk about the foreign, the alien one. And as for the structure, I would like to know that generally it's quite logical and structured, but it's not impeccable if we compare the equality of in the scale of information. As for the topic, the image of Russia and the Russians, and the analysis of notions of Russians in literature, we have 53 pages from 140, one-third of the thesis to be exact, and I've calculated that. And sometimes it seems that the analysis of the key provisions, can be considered a bit short than the thoughts about some auxiliary methods, and maybe it would be expedient to reduce the first section of the research. And as for the technical issues, I would like to note that the author can be recommended to find more opportunities to use, not to use the electronic resources, but rather books. And 1/4 of the literature used is connected with the electronic databases. It is taken from the electronic databases that, well, maybe not the most reliable sources for the scientific work. Well, these are my ideas, my private ideas. Maybe not all of them are private, but still. Overall, I believe that the thesis of Mariia Panina, the image of Russia and the Russians in contemporary Chinese journalism, corresponds to the key requirements established by the order of 2016 on conferring the academic degrees of St. Petersburg State University. And the applicant, Mariia Panina, deserves the degree of the candidate of Philology in specialization 100103, foreign literature, the literature of Far and Middle East, of Article 11, and the order of dissertation is not violated. Well, that's it. Shortly, my conclusion, my opinion. That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Irina Vladimirovna. So, please, Mikhail, you have the floor. Distinguished chairman, distinguished members of the dissertation board, dear colleagues, dear guests. As far as I see it, the thesis of Mariia resolves two goals. First, on the material of essays on Russia for contemporary Chinese writers, we detect and analyze certain stable models of representation of image of foreign culture within the framework of the concept the self and the other. And here I use the term the other, the foreign in Russian, and I agree with you on that. And also we specify the provisions of such works according to the taxonomy of the Western literature. And author is based on a wide range of works theoretical, descriptive, analytical, and so on, and beyond the works of the domestic experts in different social sciences. We see the use of a lot of Chinese works, and in bibliography I've calculated some 40-something of them, and also she regularly quotes new Western research, and that, from my point of view, allows the author to consider the topic from different perspectives, taking into account the multilateral and different approaches, worldview approaches, and demonstrates the high level of the thesis. As for the novelty, it is outlined by the results of imagological, from my point of view, of imagological analysis of the text of the selected essays in the third section, and that is, by the way, the logic of the title that fully corresponds to the title of the thesis itself. And the author offers to consider this analysis as a product of combination of three methods: imagological, literature study, and sociological content analysis. And the specific characteristics is given in the first article. The specific results dealing with the topic of research, including the key components of the structure of the image of the Russian Federation in contemporary Chinese journalism, the distribution of positive and negative assessments in certain concepts and imagems, the correlation of stereotypical depiction and individual authors' view. Well, as for general conclusions, as for the content, the functions of Chinese texts, well, they are quite expected, and they substantiate the established notions on the fact that journalism can't be completely free from any fictional elements, and quite frequently it follows some ideological and even propaganda ideas, and in the construction of the other image, to some extent we have the view of the characteristics of the self, and this opposition, the self and the other, genetically provides for the comparison that cannot be distracted from self-understanding, and these ideas have both theoretical and practical importance, and it outlines the scientific value of the work of Ms. Panina. The first two sections, well, I took them as a kind of theoretical introduction to the third article, and I'll skip this characterization, these characteristics, and I'll shift to the third section. And I agree with Alexei Anatolievich and Nikolai Anatolievich on the criteria of choosing these very texts, these very essays. They, from my point of view, are not sufficiently clear. And here I'm referring to page 78, 88. But still, the style of the literature and non-literature goals of these essays, they are different, and the author of the thesis managed to demonstrate it. And these essays allow to get a good understanding of the contemporary Chinese journalism of the usage genre, namely the travel notes. And as for the interpretation and the interpretation of the author, each of the four authors have distinctive author's image. And as for the correlation of negative and positive assessments, they vary from negative, that's led to general positive, Fanzensai. And these notional characteristics can be forecasted in the role functions of the authors. And if we use this definition of Mariia, Panina is a kind of ironic critic, Yinle is a detailed observer, Gochen is a journalist, and Ditsai is a kind of official expert and analyst, and provide some enlightenment here. And the thesis describes the essays in detail and analyzes the form and the scale of the demonstration of three modi, and also systematize the information on different kinds of imagological opposition, the self and the other, and also the data are represented in tables. And I was quite positively impressed that Alexei Anatolievich is also included in the number of imagems of Russia as a representative of the scientific community of Russian sinologists. And I know Alexei Anatolievich better, but maybe that's true still. And as for the fictional elements that I was mostly interested in, well, as I'm a literature scientist, judging by your analysis, they are expressed in Mafulin, Black Russia and White Russia, and the key generator is partially the humor the human form of information. Maybe the fictional part in other authors is maybe in a description of, for example, birch tree wood in Fedzensai, or maybe thinking about Leo Tolstoy, that's page 124, maybe in some associations, for example, in the words of Goichin, like sitting in the airport. That's a quotation of Mariia. Sitting in the airport, I was reading the book of Sholokhov, writing about the quiet flows of the dawn, but it was not that quiet in Moscow. And there is styling on, for example, the play. There are monologues from the point of view of animals, for example, and some other stories where the author of essay, for example, Mafolin, punishes his employee, forcing him to go to the theater, for example, and also the sections of his essays, for example, why Russian frigates sing, or how you shouldn't angry Russian women. It also promises a kind of humor reading, some entertainment, and that is completely different from the ones that are provided by the titles of Goichin. For example, one of the titles is as follows: "The threat to the safety of Chinese entrepreneurs." We have skinheads in Russia. And as for the mythological content of the thesis, generally I would say that that is a bit disappointing, because it's a bit trivial and superficial. Comments of Mariia on Mafolin that he's biased about Russia and Russian people and is the producer of new stereotypes. From my point of view, that is the same about other authors as well, and there is this understanding that all Chinese authors that are different in worldview still are writing considering the political censorship that is largely in place, that is in their conscience as well. And they all not only stick to some political ideology, but they also declare it explicitly. And Yin Le, for example, has this ideological bias that is quite diplomatically expressed in the words of a Russian scientist Burov. Like, China is pursuing the correct way, and I support it. And here I would put a comma mark and place another word, tavarish. And I believe that that's the correct quote to understand the chief ideas of Yudzi. And Chinese authors, as far as I see it, see the mirror for self-analysis in Russia and self-understanding, and they also profit the dogmas, and Mariia demonstrates it in the finalizing words of the first section, and that's the main conclusion as far as I believe. And I will quote these words. That's page 136. "The elements of ideological manipulation of the conscience of readers are detected because Russia is depicted as a state lagging behind China in all spheres of life, excluding some advanced achievements of Russian previous art and culture, and thus they cultivate the prevalence and the domination of their nation." And now a few discussion points that I would like to dwell upon. All of them are mostly dealing with some theoretical statements. For example, I did not fully liked the use of those borrowed terms, fictional, non-fictional, as applicable to the criteria of division of literature into fictional and non-fictional ones. Because from my point of view, that's not a step forward in literature science, as far as I see it. Because the definition of these terms is connected with the criteria of division of literature texts with fiction, with the notion of fiction, which is quite a varied notion. And these characteristics of fictional and non-fictional texts can be used in some distracted theories, and it's not applicable to a full-fledged analysis of literature material. As for the high-quality journalism, when we apply such a method, it should be considered non-fictional literature. Yet, in my report, I give an example of 2 or 3 months old. The example with the disclosure of the reports of the Journal of Spiegel journalist, Klaus Verlossos, that received a lot of awards and had a very good reputation in professional circles. And these are the disclosures that force us to think about the adequacy of non-fictional criteria as applicable to that and close types of journalism. During 7 years, this journalist, with a world recognition in 2014, he was, by the way, awarded with the title of the Journalist of the Year by CNN. He wrote articles where he partially or fully invented the plot and the heroes, and if it hadn't been for this by chance disclosure, his text would be an example of non-fiction or a prose, but in fact that is the fictional story. And I would like to remind you as well about the unfinished novel Umberto Eco, number 0, of year 2015, where in the style of Eco we have a good description of all the applicable forms of implicit falsifications in journalism that turn it into, well, using your word, fictional prose. And the traditional definitions of fiction and non-fiction literature can be used with certain provision, because not only in the Chinese literature we have such as extensive space of these intermediary texts, and before the start of the European Enlightenment, before the mid-18th century roughly, the scientific classifications of literature in this criteria seemed, well, dubious. And above all, I believe that the philology scientists and literature scientists, yet you insist on that and believe that that's your success, that, well, using the content analysis method, I believe that a literature scientist should be more delicate in dealing with such a method and such a notion. And this term, this method and idea was well, patented by sociologists quite recently. And as for context studies of semantics, of terms, mostly that is the method that is the primary basis of any high-quality academic research, regardless of whether it's philology or history. And as for statistics methods, they have long been used in philology, for example, when compiling frequency glossaries, maybe establishing authorship, for example. That's the co-linguistics that's established on that. And when we analyze specific texts, such tricks can give some fake results. And here I recollect the text of Quran, where the Sharia word, the key notions of Islam, is mentioned just once, but a word women is mentioned 59 times. And if we use the word if we use Faridi approach to Quran, then we'll have a fatwa about our elimination, and a fatwa about our elimination. And now the conclusion, based on interdisciplinary analysis methods, the dissertation work gives significant contribution to the Chinese journalism studies UDZ, and it provides for imagological content of the works dedicated to Russia. The author is quite qualified and resolves all the objectives quite well, correctly working with the text material represented by the essays of 4 Chinese authors, and also the system of the genres of Chinese literature overall. And as for the argumentation and the conclusions, they're quite substantiated, and they reflect the high level of expert novel of the author, and also it has the sphere for future implementation in the educational process and also in the international relations process. And the thesis of Mariia Panina conforms with the key requirements, and here I won't list the number of these orders. And the applicant, Mariia Panina, for sure deserves, from my point of view, deserves the conferring of the title of the candidate of philology in the chosen specialization. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mikhail. Our dear colleague, Professor Van Leer. Professor, yes, your report, please. Thank you very much. Distinguished colleagues and dear friends, I'm very glad that I have an honor today to participate in your scientific event. And I really appreciate this cooperation. And that is my report on the thesis of Mariia Panina on the topic the image of Russia and the Russians in contemporary Chinese journalism, on travel essays, submitted for the defense in specialization 10103, the foreign literature and the literature of Middle East and Far East. Along the development of the policy of reforms and transparency and the use of soft power in Chinese economy, we see the increase in communication of China with different countries of the world, and such flourishing leads to fruitful cooperation between China and Russia in all spheres, the increase of cultural cooperation and mutual penetration. The image of Russia and the Russians is something that we see quite frequently in the Chinese literature and Chinese journalism. Yet the new cultural mission that is based on the promotion of the Chinese culture in the world. China has little scientists that dedicate their studies to the image of Russia and Russians in the Chinese literature, and particularly in
At least we can say that this subject hasn't been researched in a special or systematic manner, and thus the choice of the topic of this thesis is irrelevant and quite a pioneer type one in terms of sinology literature studies, not only in Russia but also in China. In other words, the thesis by Mariia Panina, the image of Russia and the Russian and contemporary Chinese journalism, is not only filling gaps in Russian sinology, but also has done what Chinese researchers haven't managed to do. This thesis can be considered as a scientific discovery, precious experience in sinology literature studies of two countries. And that's the scientific importance, academic relevance of the topic, and the innovative character of the idea. And we can say that the thesis is an innovative one. The thesis embraces literature criticism problems. The author primarily scrutinizes constant characteristics and the means of the establishment of the image of Russians in modern journalism within the context of general literature classification, and analyzes syncretic nature of Chinese journalism. Combining the self and the other, the author of such sites as politics, economy, culture, and others, using geographical methods, is characterizing the image of Russia and Russians very clearly and very precisely in Chinese literature. She provides great help to us in finding what is the image of Russia and Russians in China, and the object and the goal of the research have been defined clearly and precisely. The goals and the reasons of the work are defined clearly at the beginning of the thesis, and based on main essay type literature and journalism. Thesis is dealing with interdisciplinary research, historical one, sociological one, national and psychological, in terms of the image of state and a nation. The author, using different research methods, gives a subtle analysis of genre composition, word expression, and fictional means, the ratio, time, space, and others. And the author is rightfully saying that with the pace of the development of humanitarian sciences, people are deeming more and more importance to interaction and interpenetration of cultures, and thus we see the formation of definite, generally accepted norms of thinking, based on which we see the development of self and the other as a binary constant. and it is to be considered the basis for the research of the image of Russia and Russians, and everything provides the depth, the width, and innovation and innovative thinking of this thesis. The author is widely using and citing both Russian and foreign literature, and that gives special value to the dissertation, not only the theoretical one, but the practical one. The dissertation, the thesis, can also be considered a significant contribution in sinology. The first chapter, methodology, research methodology of nation image in journalism, interdisciplinary approach. A model is applied, which is self and the other. The structure of Russia's image is demonstrated clearly in terms of Chinese journalism, and we see the clarification of the image notion. In this chapter, the author defines such terms as stereotype, imago, theme, topic, concept, and imago, theme, and others. Also, she has concluded the image of Russia, which is revealed in other nations with the help of three layers: idea, aesthetics, genre, composition, and stylistics. And in this chapter, we see the representation of imagology structure and content analysis method in terms of fictional and journalism texts, and we see a comprehensive system of interdisciplinary approach to the scrutiny of Russia's image and Russians' image and their evolution in Chinese journalism. And the chapter is theoretical and scientific. The author is quite skillful in terms of applying coding, which is conferring quantity and quality to words, and the frequency of keywords, which led to relevant conclusions. Such methods is very demonstrative and justified. The second chapter, Modern Chinese Journalism, between literature and journalism, we see subtle analysis of Chinese journalism and combination of three types of literature, which is Sanwen, Baogao, Wensue, and Yuzi. This chapter is the proof of the fact that Ms. Panina is bold in terms of scientific research and has an aesthetic taste and is able to catch the essence of complicated notions and phenomena, and provides a correct analysis in terms of some open questions. She implies that there is a subordinate connection between those three genres. Essay type literature is linked with essay, but travel essay is a branch of the essay type literature. Such definition basically coincides with the views of Chinese scientists, and genres of Chinese literature are drastically different from the European ones, and the author, basing on the division of Russian and Chinese works in different genres, is noting precisely that Chinese genres are much wider than the European ones, though Chinese literature borrowed the notions of fiction and non-fiction from the West. Still, there is a huge difference between them. We can't but agree with the author that the inclusive type of the notion of Sanwen in Chinese literature is much wider. It embraces almost all literature genres, excluding poetry, drama, fiction, which is Xiaoshou. Following the history of Sanwen development, the author came to the conclusion that it drastically transforms in the journalist texts and notes, essays, feuilletons, and feature articles. Sanven is conferred a narrower sense, and Karen Sanven has the following traits. The form is scattered, but the spirit is concentrated. Second, deep senses and type of narrative. And third is fine literature character. And journalism texts have been disintegrated from Sanven and have become a different type of articles, which is the essay type literature, Bangao and Sua. And unlike Zankan notes, which have a special preference to different thought process, unlike Sanven essay, they make an emphasis on lyrics. And Bangao Vensu is oriented at crucial topics and present topics, which use special fictional methods. And with the use of those methods, there is an opportunity to demonstrate drastically transforming and developing social reality, which helps people to perceive the essence of real life. In this chapter, the author provides understanding that currently there is that the difference between fictional and journalism text is vague, syncretic, and sometimes these genres become interconnected. It has become the main trend of literature development, and Western researchers try to provide a clear-cut border between literature journalist texts and works, and Chinese scientists think that the genre volume of Chinese essay literature is quite extensive, and it covers a lot of literature forms and has a significant degree of literature freedom. And it is here where the author notes that Bangao Vensu has unlimited valuable space which is waiting to be mastered. The third chapter, Russia and Russian travel essays of modern Chinese writers, the author of the thesis basing on NKI database gathered keywords and almost all the materials about travel notes which reflect Russia image. And here we see the amount of effort exerted by the applicant and the high level of mastering both Russian and Chinese languages, and an ability to activate fresh leading materials of the period 2000-2016, which cover such questions. And the chapter is divided into 4 chapters where we see the use of geographical statistical methods, and also we see the subtle analysis of typical works of 4 modern writers. In the first part, the narrative model is scrutinized, also characteristics of stylistics and others. In the essay of Maffolin, Black and White Russia, which author of the thesis considers to be the book of Chinese trips in modern Russia. And it is noted that Maffolin is distinguished by satire definition of the Russian image, which is typical for Chinese. For instance, Russian ladies, Russian laziness, and others. And the author uses tables to analyze the image of Russians, because both Black Russia and White Russia have the self and the other this binary constant, which has different revelations in the national character, culture, politics, and economics. The stance of Ms. Panina is clear and evident. She states that Marfolin's Black and White Russia provides for the complicated and multifaceted image of Russians and has vivid documentary traits of essay-type literature. In the second paragraph, the author shows Russia, Witness in Russia by Ye Yunle, which is the example of objective monitoring, and the author thinks that documentary is one of the distinctive features of the essay-type literature, and tables and schemes are used to scrutinize the image of the Soviet Union and its heads, which provide the clarification of the ratio, the self and the other, and based on the image of politics and culture. In this part we see the settled characteristic of Russia and its governing borders. The author is dividing the image reflected in the book into two types: the collapsing Soviet Union and rising Russia. In the third paragraph we see the research of Russia and Russians' image through the tragedy of Nordost by Go Chen. The author implies that Chinese author Go Chen was correct in evaluating the activities the actions by the Russian government, refusal to fulfill the requirements of terrorists, and successful liberation of hostages. The author of the thesis rightfully implies that this work is primarily objective, and the basis of the work is connected with the fact that the essay-type literature is based on reality and on real materials, and besides, it is not about simple enumeration of facts and materials, but also a kind of fictional interpreting. And here we see the composition of the literature work. In terms of narrative style, the author rightfully states that the work has the traits of polyphony, but in terms of the angle of the narrative, the dimension of the narrative, the narrators are divided into three types. The first, the journalist, the eyewitness. The second, the artist who is preparing the report with certain feelings. And the third, publicist, who is analyzing security problems existing in Russia. Based on that, the author is interpreting the image of Russia in his work, and Mariia is stating rightfully that Russia's image in Go Chen's work is divided into two types: the powerful Russia and weak Russia. In the fourth part, we see the analysis of travel essays by Fancy Tsai, Lucy Shuangchenzi, and at the beginning the author of the dissertation demonstrates translations of this work in Russia, and she implies that this book has such traits as the narration by the author, which is characterized by documentary type and also reinforces the truthfulness and intertextual motives, ring-type composition and others. Besides, the author also notes that this book is saturated with Russian culturology elements, such as names of writers, poets, artists, and musical and drama events, museums and architectural sites. The author comes to a conclusion that four types of Russian people are demonstrated in the book. First, artistic representatives, which involve writers, artists, musicians. The second type is sinologists, the third type is politicians, and the fourth type is other Russian people, and also everything is provided with scientific analysis. To conclude the above mentioned, we come to the conclusion that the thesis is a profound theoretical work, and the proof of the profound theoretical knowledge of the author and her scope of knowledge in terms of humanitarian knowledge, history, literature, typology, culturology, and other aspects which are involved. The author demonstrates excellent mastering of the object of the research and has a very high scientific and research level, which defines the scientific character and logical type of the thesis, and the research methods are original and scientific. I do not have any principal contradictions to the content, but I have some questions which, as I see them, can be discussed. As I see it, in China, there is a lot of research in terms of the perception of Russian literature by Chinese writers such as Lu Xun, Mao Dun, Bazin, and others. Here, the author is referring to the views of the Russian scientists only. I think that's the gap. We need to take into account to a certain degree the Chinese research as well, as such factor would have contributed to the multifaceted and profound character of the work. And I think similar case can be encountered in the clarification of essay-type literature. The author is sticking to the notion essay-type literature, Bagao and Sur, only from European or Russian literature, but she needs to approach Chinese perception to the maximum level. Besides understanding the notion of essay-type literature, the author is based on internet sources to a large extent. Such references sometimes reflect the persuasive character of the work. I think that official sources are to be cited. Go Chen is a male writer, but in the text of the thesis, his name is used in a different manner in the Russian language. The notion Chinese essay, travel essay should have been clarified in more details, because it can be divided into three types: narrative, lyrics, landscape, and in some cases three components emerge with each other. And in the last paragraph of the second chapter, the author of the thesis concentrated only on the narrative genre. As a genre, the travel essay exists in Chinese literature and has been existing for many centuries. For instance, Yuan Lao notes or the works by the Fan Junan poet, or works by Ouyang Su. The modern Chinese literature pays more attention to historic and humanitarian senses of travel notes. There are a lot of similar works in China which depict the image of Russia or different Russian people, but the author should also dwell upon such works as a book by Van Man, Remembering the USSR, or the collection of travel notes, The Morning Dawn over the Don River, or the notes, other notes by the four above-mentioned authors, which are researched in this thesis. For instance, the book by Yu Yun Lei, The Trip Across Russia, or The Free Trip Across Russia, or The Night Talk in Russia, or Humor About Russia. Talking about the perception of Russia in China, especially such writers as Lucien Maudun or Bazin, the author of the thesis, is to refer not only to the views of Russian scientists, but also to the Chinese ones, because the thesis is dedicated to the topic of the image of Russia and Russians in China. And there is such an expression in China: the faults of the gem can't eliminate its splendor, which means that minor faults can't eliminate the advantages. The thesis of Mariia Panina, The Image of Russia and Russians in Modern Chinese Journalism, complies with the requirements set by the order number 68211 as of the 1st of September 2016 on the conferring academic degrees at St. Petersburg State Universities, and Ms. Panina is to be conferred the academic degree of PhD in Philology in specialization 100103, Foreign Literature, Literature of Middle and Far East. Van Leer, Professor of Beijing University of Foreign Languages. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Van Leer. That's a wonderful report, as usual, in a wonderful Russian language.
So, please, dear colleagues, maybe turn off the sound a bit. Yes, right now it's okay. And last is my report. The thesis of Mariia Panina, The Image of Russia and the Russians in Contemporary Journalism, is dedicated to essays of Chinese writers that were published in 2010, and to the fact how this contradiction of the self and the other is demonstrated in such works. As I believe, this issue is very interesting for Oriental scientists and to those that are working with China, because it responds how Russia is perceived by masses in our main partner in the West. Do we have any dynamics of the change of this perception, any specific characteristics in the image of Russia and the Russians? What are immanent and what are artificially imposed? And such analysis provides for a synthesis of the classical literature studies method and statistics, politology, linguistics, and so on. And this makes the work really comprehensive and requires a very varied approach. And in this regard, Mariia demonstrates a very high skill of work and can provide very good conclusions. And as for the modes of establishing the image of Russia and the Russians in contemporary Chinese journalism within the framework of interdisciplinary approach to the study of the image of the nation that is adequate to the publicism in China. That's how it formed on page 4. And at the same time, the dissertation covers and analyzes other important issues from philology, comparative studies. For example, the work undertook an attempt to, quote, explain the place and of the category of Chinese journalism in the general literature classification, and to demonstrate the possible categories apparatus as regards to the studies of Chinese journalism. That's page 14. And mostly that's valuable and in demand by the scientific community. And in this regard, we have a detailed analysis of Baogao venture in synchronous and diachronic aspects, and also the argumented thoughts about the publicism as applicable to the Chinese reality is also of interest. The dissertation has 3 sections. And it should be noted that what we see, the glossary that we see contains not only the transcription and but also hieroglyphs. But there's just a doubt whether we should include fiction and non-fiction English terms, considering their widespread, not only in the special literature but also in general use, and also the translation of non-fiction that is translated as non-fiction literature, and by the way, it was already mentioned by Mikhail Sergeyevich Pelevin. The work is based on serious source base and attracted research. We have 163 sources, and also we see the wide range of internet resources, many new ones. The articles and books published in the recent 5 years. Mariia demonstrates a very good understanding of the contemporary scientific analysis in literature studies and in adjacent philology discipline. The work is well structured. The language is quite understandable, and it was the results were tested at 5 conferences, and 2 of them are the international forums. But at the same time, when reading a dissertation, I had several remarks that I would like to mention. First, it would be good to have a more well-devised composition of the content of dissertation, because as for talking about China, it happens just on page 53, and as for the shift to the topic of discussion, that's page 80 something. And also we should have the explanation of the volume of text in hieroglyphs to which the researcher refers. The person that has no experience of working with Chinese text cannot imagine how can we compare the volume of the Chinese text and the Russian text. 180,000 hieroglyphs, is it a lot, or is it some small amount? We don't understand it. And as for the works of sinologists without context, for example, the words of Sorokin, that the classical literature of China within the framework of its history was developing without the connection with the international literature, that's page 55, should be understood not literally, because in the article that is quoted, Vladislav Fyodorowich Sorokin further on dwells upon the fact that he can equalize this idea, because it was not only connected, but it formed the classical literature of a large territory of the countries, and this continuity really overcomes the European ones, and European is called the worldly. And then the author takes this away by the explanation, and also the quotation has no context, and this can cause some critical remarks of the readers. And as for the thoughts on the science in the Oriental countries, then I believe that such sources were not very relevant, because there were no references to what kind of East it is, Far East, Middle East, what is, and the situation in these regions is quite different. When we talk about Vaughan, it would be relevant to shift to the practice of writing reports to the name of the highest person. And by the way, those were included as the sample of philology. And also it would be useful to use the BD works. And by the way, it was mentioned by Professor Van Leer, where the genre of a travelogue is represented in quite a wide variety, and aesthetically it really provided the contemporary aesthetics. And contemporary Chinese researchers do not cover this thing, but still, in order to understand the general issues, this analysis would be quite expedient. Then, some statements on the Chinese culture should be more delicate, except poetry in Seven. We also have the report of epitaph, the report on epitaphs of treatises, and this can be found in such works of in the works that lasted up until the 20th century, and thus taking away the status of top philology could be formed in a more in a less a dubious way. If we had had some examples from classical Chinese literature, and fifth, maybe it's not very justified to have such a volume of the works on terminological standards, and also we see a bit of saturation of the terms in some useful categories. For example, in the references to Lotman. For example, Lotman has a lot of quite understandable definitions that can be used by any philology expert, or maybe by any person, literate person. So maybe that could be used in future work. And it should be noted that as for my comments, they are private comments and they do not interfere with a high level of assessment. But we should take into they should just be taken into account when in future work. The dissertation has made a very good impression, and also I appreciated the creative approach of the research, and thus, regardless of the voiced comments, we can conclude that the dissertation of Ms. Panina represents full-fledged comprehensive research that has scientific novelty. It is performed at the top professional level, and it is dedicated to the issue that is of particularly practical and theoretical importance. And above the experts in theory and history of contemporary literature, this work can be useful to researchers of political thought of the 20th century, and to other scientists that are working with public ideas in different kinds of fiction. And dissertation is quite logical and reassuring. So this dissertation of Ms. Panina, the image of Russia and the Russians in Chinese journalism, conforms with the key requirements of the order issued in 2016 on the order of conferring academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. And the applicant deserves to get the degree of the candidate of philology in 10.0103 foreign literature, Far East and Middle East. That's Article 1. Article 1 is not violated. So that's it. Thank you very much. Do we have any additional remarks? So now the reply of the applicant. Distinguished Alexander Georgievich, distinguished members of the board, thank you very much for the appraisal of my work and for valuable comments. I'm thankful for that, and I accept them, and allow me to give the answers to the questions that were voiced. I agree with the desire of Alexander Georgievich to decipher the volume of works in hieroglyphs, because the Chinese words are disyllabic. Therefore, the volume should be reduced twice in order to represent the number of words, because in domestic practice we use such a definition as the number of characters, but for Chinese text the number of characters will equal the number of hieroglyphs, but the volume of information that is found in the hieroglyph, it's much higher than in any alphabetic language. And I also accept and understand the importance of your recommendations and the recommendation of Professor Van Leer to juxtapose contemporary and ancient forms of BT, travel essays. And due to the complexity of the topic, I believe that a separate research should be done on this topic. And as for the notions of fiction and non-fiction, they are quite extensive, and they were included in the glossary in order to unify the work in the use of foreign words and to give all the foreign terms a translation to the Russian language. And at the same time, I cannot agree with the fact that the definition and translation of these terms in the context of this research should not be done at all. The detection of criteria of fiction is really relevant for the research material because the Chinese journalism is quite syncretic, and as for the striving of Western science to have strict division, it is very hard to explain this really present but still rather hard to understand fiction modus. What is it? Just stylistics, just the unfabled plot or its correspondence with the real events, and also the comment of Mikhail Sergeyevich on the division between the fiction and non-fiction really supports this issue that remains open. As for the remark of Irina Vladimirovna on the time of the emergence of imagology as science, I understand that. I really pity that I did not define this period when it emerged, the late 20. That I wrote that it's 20th century, and I also accept the comment of Nikolai Anatolyevich on the fact that I should have studied it in more detail, the origin of the term imagology. And I would also like to make a comment on terminology in this opposition, self and other, self and foreign. There is a widespread variant, the one and the other, and the foreign. And this term, the other, was chosen due to its neutral connotation and also due to the fact that it is closer in translation with the English term. Yet, of course, the foreign, if we talk about the opposition, it's more exact, the self and the other. And as regards to the comment on the prevalence of references to the electronic resources, I can just state that I tried to use the resources of local libraries to the maximum extent, and as for paper carriers, unfortunately they are not enough. And for future research, I plan to work in the libraries of the central part of Russia, and if I have an opportunity in Chinese libraries as well. And the major part of the references are to the works of to the works and articles that exist in paper form. And the general remark from all the reports on the short third section, I really take it with gratitude, accept it with gratitude, and I will take it into account in my future work. And one of the most important goals of my work was to elaborate a comprehensive approach to the fiction and journalistic materials that combine different types of modi. Therefore, the first and the second section, as Mikhail Sergeyevich noted and Professor Van Lee noted, these are not just theoretical and methodological introduction to the third one, but also contain new wordings that can be useful when we study when we research the image of the nation and Chinese publicism. So still here is the long way to go to expand the opportunities of the methods and to increase the database. In my future work, I will include the recommended works by Professor Van Lee and by Nikolai Anatolyevich. I will include Van Man, and also the collected works by the editorship of Chen Jinhua, and also the works of Chinese writers on the perception of Russian literature in China, and also the studies of Chinese essay literature. And I will also try to dwell upon the field that Nikolai Anatolyevich mentioned. I would like to consider the stereotypes that authors had before going to Russia and what they had when they had established a contact with the other nation. And as for all the remarks on terminology, wordings, and also the filling in the gap of the mentioned researchers for Russian and Chinese and foreign scientists will be taken into account in my future work. And once again, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mariia. Dear colleagues, if you have any comments. Well, getting back to this term, the one and the other. Yes, you've taken the translation of the other, but it really contradicts not to the word the self, but it contradicts self. But self, it's not your own. And therefore, the filling in of this semantics, it's not just the same as English self and other. Therefore, if you choose a Russian your own, then maybe the foreign is more of an antonym to it. Thank you very much, Nikolai. Professor Van Leer, is everything okay? Oh, yes, it seems that it's so. So, do we have anyone willing to speak out? Anyone registered? Well then, allow me on behalf of the scientific advisor, Nadezhda Khuziatova, I would like to read part of her report. That's quite a large report, but unfortunately she didn't have a chance to come in person, yet she wanted that. And that is quite a full-fledged report on the work, and it has all the necessary attributes. It has also the correlation of attracted material, of chosen materials. So the relevance of the research is outlined by the importance of the topic of Russia in the Chinese contemporary literature, the searching for ways of bringing these two cultures closer, and the mitigation of negative impact that is caused by misunderstanding is the important goal that goes beyond the borders of literature science. And the relevance of this problem covered by by Ms. Panina is outlined by insufficient attention that this topic receives, and it contradicts the trend to the convergence of genres and the shift of literature and journalistic forms. And the goal of this research that provides for the combination of two scientific paradigms and the study of the image of Russia in Chinese travel notes is implemented on the basis of interdisciplinary approach with attracting the imagological and literature studies, and also linguistic methods and content analysis. And this I support the conclusion of the author that journalism is on the mid-position between literature and journalism, and it goes beyond the borders of literature, and it plays an important political and cultural historical role. The key peculiarity of the contemporary Chinese journalism, as the author states, is the syncretic nature that combines the fictional journalism and publicist modi, and the choice of the works for analysis and for summarizing is caused by the objectives of the thesis, and arises no doubt. So in the work considers four authors of the early 20th centuries that worked with Russia and the Russians, and the studied essays give an understanding of the importance of the topic of Russia in the creative works of Chinese writers, and the analysis of the works that is included into the third section is ingrained in the logic. And the essays of Chinese authors that were analyzed using the interdisciplinary approach allowed to establish the complex of fictional, publicistic and journalistic modi, and this data was were added up to the concept content of the image of Russia, and also detected the individual approach of the author to the representation of the image of Russia and the Russians.
Another advantage of the thesis is the use of the wide range of literature, philosophical, imagology, linguistics and culturology works of Russian, Chinese and American scientists in all the aspects of scientific problematics raised in this research. Also, the use of Chinese works is very precious, both in terms of Chinese journalism and its history. A special paragraph is defined where journalism is scrutinized within the framework of Chinese literature classification and the involvement of syncretism of modern Chinese journalism in comparison with similar phenomena in world literature is, in our view, an innovative approach to the research of fictional and journalism text. The interdisciplinary approach based on binary, synchronous and approach of methods and the formation of the image of Russia and Russians in China, and able to define the borders of publicism and journalism modes in the essay and travel essay, and also to prove the existence of different constituent parts in one text which are connected with Russia's image. The dissertation is of great theoretical and practical significance as the main constituent part of modern literature process in China, and also for the development of relevant university courses. The work will be very useful both for theoreticians who deal with general issues of publicism and practical experts. The remarks made just emphasize the fact that the work is important but hasn't been researched to the maximum level. For instance, the issue of the hybrid of Sivan type and journalism. Can we define the overall range of journalism texts and fictional texts as the independent literature genre? And can we use the popularization methods of Russian culture through travel, essays, and other journalism forms improve the image of Russia and Russians in China? The work of Ms. Panina, The Image of Russia and the Russians in Contemporary Chinese Journalism based on travel essays, is an individual and holistic scientific work which complies with all the requirements to such works. So that's the remarks by the mentor. If you don't have any other remarks or comments, now we start the deliberation in the run of 5 minutes, and I ask to switch off the broadcast. And I would like to ask all people who are not the members of the Dissertation Board to leave the hall and to come back when the deliberation.
Так, заседание продолжается.
So we continue the session. I would like to ask you to switch on the broadcast. Is it working? Okay, thank you very much. And now We have our decisive moments of the session. The question is about the conferring the academic degree, and the voting is open. I would like to remind you of the fact that the decision of the Dissertation Board on the conferring the academic title is considered to be positive if we have more than 50% of the board members voting in favor of that, in conformity with the Section 23 of the Order on the Procedure of Granting Academic Degrees at St. Petersburg State University, Appendix number 1 to the order. The member of the board, Professor Nikolai Samoilov. I think that the work, I vote in favor of conferring the title. The member of the degree of the board, Mikhail Pelevin. I vote for that. Member of the board, Irina Kulganik. I vote for that. Thank you very much. The member of the board, Professor Van Leer. Do you vote for conferring the title? Yes, I vote for that. Thank you very much. And finally, I, as the chairperson of the board, Alexander Starozhuk, vote for it. So thus, dear colleagues, I would like to announce that we have
О присуждении ученой степени кандидата филологических наук по специальности 10.01.03. Литература народа.
And so we decided to confer the degree to Ms. Panina in specialization 10.01.03, and this decision is made. And now I ask Mariia to give the closing remarks, if you have anything to say. Well, just I would like first and foremost to extend my gratitude to the members of the Dissertation Board and to Alexey Anatolievich. I know that it wasn't that easy to organize this session, and you spent a lot of time for the organization of it and to read and to assess the work, and I really appreciate it, considering the fact that it was done for an external applicant. And I would also like to express my heartfelt gratitude to my scientific advisor, to Nadezhda Konstantinovna Khodziatova, because she always supported me and guided me during the whole period of study at the university. She inspired me in my work, and she helped me to choose the topic and to organize it as you see it today. And I would also like to thank my parents and my friends that supported me, and I would like to thank the interpreters and the members of the dissertation service for the impeccable technical organization of the defense. Thank you very much. I'm really glad that our colleague from Vladivostok has defended her thesis today. The dissertation, as far as I see it, is really a good one, and it demonstrates great prospects that the scientist has, and I congratulate you on that, and first and foremost your scientific advisor, Nadezhda Konstantinovna, and I really hope that this scientific school that is now being established in Vladivostok will see an increase of such people and such works. So thank you very much to every participant, the members of the board, and thank you very much to the interpreters and to the support services. And here I would like to close the session. Once again, thank you very much everyone for the participation, and please turn off the broadcast.